Welcome to the CIO Evolution. In this podcast, we'll explore the Chief Information Officer's role in executing a new ongoing leadership imperative, digital transformation that promotes agility and resilience. How do CIOs upgrade legacy networks? What are the financial challenges CIOs face? And what are the security measures that are required in the new work from anywhere, mobile and cloud-based world?
Welcome to another episode of the CIO Evolution. I'm Chris Jablonski, Director of CXO Revolutionaries and Community. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming James Beeson, advisor, board member, and investor, and former Global CISO for the Cigna Group and GE Capital Companies. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Chris. I'm thrilled to be here. Glad to be here this morning.
So
looking
are
forward
we.
to the discussion.
Excellent. So you recently participated in an event put on by part of the team that I'm on called the CXO Exchange, sponsored by Zscaler. It was last month in Nashville, and there you shared your views on managing risks, briefing boards, and you were on a panel when you did that. I heard a lot of great feedback about it, so I was hoping you can reshare your key advice here so that it reaches a wider audience. So first up, you gave a rule of thumb, I should say 5, when conveying risk categories to the board. Would you mind walking us through those categories?
Sure, absolutely. And at the end of the day, I tend to say the thing with the board and typically with executive leadership teams is you want to keep it in terms that they can understand, right, and not security geek speak, as I like to put it. And so I basically boil the risks that I talk to them about down into 5 key categories, as you mentioned. The first one, which is typically the North Star, is availability. In other words, it's business disruption, and anything that disrupts the business operationally is not good, right? And that's typically the North Star for the CIO as well. If your systems are down, that's bad news, right? The second one is unauthorized access. And again, I think of that very generically. It doesn't matter whether it's internal, external, accidental, on purpose, malicious. It doesn't matter. If people have access to information that they should not have access to, particularly if it's sensitive, that's a bad thing. So that's the second risk category I talk to them about. The next one, which is the one that gets most of the headlines, is data leakage or data loss. And when you lose a pile of data, and again, it doesn't matter if it's accidental, on purpose, malicious, if somebody leaves their laptop in the car and it's got a spreadsheet full of personally identifiable information or PHI health information, that's bad news. So that's the third one, right? The fourth one is about resiliency and recoverability, if you will, right? A lot of the technology ecosystems are very fragile now, so anytime you have an operational disruption, you need to have the resiliency to be able to recover from that or never go down in the first place because you've got highly resilient systems. And then the final one is regulatory non-compliance, right? And again, almost every business has got to comply with some set of regulations. Many are much more complicated, like healthcare or financial services. Some are not as complicated, but whatever that is, you need to be compliant with those or it could create fines and all sorts of other things. So that's the way I think about the large risk categories when I talk to executive leadership teams or boards of directors.
Is it safe to say that the last one, regulatory compliance, is the most easily understood by the board, and then maybe something like data leakage loss comes in second simply because of the headlines and they clearly understand what the impact of that would be?
I would say the one that's easiest for them to understand, honestly, is availability. So it's because if the system is down, if customers can't get on the website, if they can't call in, if we can't process credit cards and you're a credit card company, that's not good. So they absolutely understand operational disruption. They certainly understand regulatory compliance, although when you're in a highly regulated environment like healthcare, the regulations are, they're crazy. There's huge number of regulations. There are federal regulations, for example, in the U.S. Each state has regulations. Some counties and cities have additional regulations. And of course, as soon as you go internationally, just tenfold that into literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different regulations that you need to be able to comply with, right? So they certainly understand the category, I think, probably not so much all the gory detail of exactly what things we have to be compliant with.
So you were at Cigna. Congratulations. I believe you just announced your retirement, right? So
That's right.
Global CISO for how many years?
7 years.
7 years.
7 years.
And during that time, when it came to AI, at least in the last, say, 2 years, things got pretty interesting, and you had to explain AI-related risks to your board while at Cigna. Can you walk us through, perhaps tell a story of how you conveyed that?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to take us way back to the beginning of 2023. And we had a board meeting in February, I believe, if I remember the month right. And of course, the first question out of the mouth of the audit committee, I should say the board, but it was the audit committee, was, what about this new thing called generative AI or large language models? What's the good, what's the bad? And of course my answer was, well, there's some pluses and there's some minuses. But the way I talked about the risk was twofold. One, at that time, I believed that the largest risk, right, to Cigna was regulatory unknown, right? So there aren't any solid regulations yet in the U.S., at least not very many yet, right? But they're coming, right? And we know they're coming. And of course, we've seen these recent regulations in the EU, which are pretty stringent and they're strict, and the penalty is massive, 7% of global revenue, if I remember correctly. So to me, the biggest risk for the company is if we go invest a huge amount of money to do something in generative AI, using generative AI, and then a regulation comes along and we go, we just wasted $20 million trying to do something that we can't do.
Right.
Now, I say that, and then I step back and say, it depends on where the focus is, right? If you're focusing on efficiency of, common processes, think call center, website, things like that, to just help the customer experience and speed processes up, that's pretty low risk. The odds are the regulators aren't going to come in and say, you can't do that.
Right.
If you begin to think about how to use generative AI for a critical business process, say processing a claim or making a determination whether someone should get service, or at a hospital or a doctor's office to use it to diagnose something that's wrong with somebody, that's way riskier. So to me, that was the number one risk I talked about. The other risk, I believe the biggest risk, macro risk, is I call it content authentication. I'm sure there are people that would argue that's not a good way to say it, but that's what I call it. And I actually told the board a story about what I did, right? And so this was back in January of 2023. As I recall, it was ChatGPT-3 at that time. And of course, being the security guy I am, the first thing I wanted to do is learn more about this generative AI capability. So I got a PC. It had nothing to do with me. I logged onto the internet. I got myself a ChatGPT 3.0 account, and I said, write me a bio for James Beeson, cybersecurity guy. That's literally all I told it. And it went away, and it came back in a few minutes, and it spit this beautiful 2-page bio out. I mean, this thing was really well done. I would have probably gone to a publisher or somebody and paid them, $5,000 to spit out as beautiful of a bio. The only problem was it was about 85% accurate, so it wasn't completely accurate. And one of the things that really stuck out to me is it said, and James won an Olympic gold medal in swimming.
Wow.
And I thought, okay, I did? Where's my medal? So anyway, so because of that, I was like, okay, there's got to be a Beeson. There's got to be. How did it come up with me winning an Olympic gold medal? There has to be some tie somewhere. Yeah. I did a pretty extensive amount of research. Could not find any link of any kind. So I have no idea how it came up with that. And when I told the story to the board, the thing that, what I said is, the thing that scares me is not so much that, they use the word hallucination. It's not so much that, it's how long is it going to be before you can't prove that I didn't win one? And so that's the piece that kind of gets scary, because all of the companies on the planet are digitizing. As I don't know who famously said the world's being eaten by software, but I like the statement. And the verification is all also digital, right? And how long will it be before you can't prove that I didn't win it? And so that's what worries me, is the content authentication. If you're a big company, as we share information with other companies or with customers, you want to know the content's authentic. And as we get information from our partners and customers, the same thing. So just like we worry about, okay, is James who he says it is? Well, I have an ID and a password. Well, that's person authentication. Right. We've been working on that. We've worked heavily for the last 20 years on device authentication. Is the device legit? Is it coming from someplace we expect it to? Now we also have to worry about content or information authentication. And of course, you already see that to some extent in the disinformation, misinformation world, but this capability is going to make that explode, I think exponentially, right?
So when you presented this to the board, these stories, what was the response?
I think some questions, or some looking and thinking through. Yes, that makes a lot of sense, and then questions more than anything about, okay, well, what are we going to do as a company to go and ensure, right, that we can get our customers and our partners comfortable that that our information is authentic. So I think that was one piece, and then of course there was a lot of conversation, which is more aimed at my boss at the time, on what's the plan for us to leverage generative AI to help the company move forward. And so that was less. It became less about security, if you will, and more about just in general. What are we doing? We did have some discussion about the risk of generative AI from a bad actor perspective, and of course we're now already seeing that the bad actors are using it to, I'll use the word, polish their phishing capability, and they can do much more volume much faster now using this capability. And hey, they have no regulators in their way because they don't pay attention to them.
So let's broaden this discussion out to how the board's understanding of cybersecurity issues evolved over the course of your career. Like in this case, I'm not sure what the composition or how many people were on the board. Maybe some of them had technical expertise, maybe some didn't. But I would imagine over time, it is getting better, their understanding of these risks. So how would you say overall, like if you gave the same story today, I'm sure it would have been received a little bit differently, right, than just a year or so ago?
Sure. I my view is that most boards, and including the Cigna board, are definitely increasing their knowledge and their education and their understanding of cyber. From my perspective, we've taken them on a journey, over the 7 years I was there, using industry level standards, and we use NIST. There's no big secret. We put that in our 10K, right? We follow the NIST framework, and so you can talk to them at that high level using that simple framework of identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. It's very simple. It's easily understandable because it's more in business language than it is in some sort of security geek speak. So I think we've done a good job to increase their education over the years. There are definitely board members, right, that have more expertise than others in either technology or in cybersecurity or on the government side, for example. But it's definitely improved, and we also made a point, of taking an opportunity to do education. Each time we would do a full board presentation, we would always have some piece of something educational in there, whether it was take them on a journey of what happened at MGM, or take them on a journey of what happened at Marriott. Well, that's a really good educational tool that kind of helps them understand the cyber risk landscape. And we also do tabletops and that sort of thing occasionally with the board. So
in those cases, would they give you more than 10 minutes?
Yes, yeah. Usually, and I probably shouldn't even say this publicly, but usually, they'll put 10, 20 minutes on the venue, and it ends up taking 45, and the CFO staring at you saying, can you hurry up, because we've got other topics that have to be covered here. Right, and I'm sort of teasing, but they were always very interested, right, in what's happening, what our posture looks like, what we're doing to mitigate risks. It's an interesting topic.
Well, we're actually going to talk about some of the other roles in the C-suite So you mentioned that you partnered with the CIO, right? In some cases with the AI story, and you both would be the ultimate technical authority, for the company, authorized to give like your perspective on that topic. But then you have the CEO and CFO who have the ultimate fiduciary responsibility. So what were the dynamics, given you're in a meeting or maybe prepping for a board meeting, among all these roles, especially now with the SEC rules, regulations, and liability, it's coming up. What's your perspective on that?
Sure. Well, my view is, and there's a lot of debate about this actually in the CISO community, right? And what I mean by that is there's debate about where should the CISO report to, right? Sure. That's always been, kind of this big thing, and it's gotten a lot of press. My personal opinion is I don't think it matters that much right now. A lot of people will argue with me there, I realize that. But to me, it's less about the where it reports to and more about the relationship you have with the person that it reports to. And you've got to have a strong trust relationship, right? And so, at least with Noel, my former boss at Cigna, we had a very strong trust relationship. And that the key word there is integrity and trust, and making sure she understands, the skeletons in the closet and where the risks are. And her trusting that we're going to put together the right kind of information to have the board be well informed about where the risk exists, where and what we're doing over time to mitigate that risk.
I'd have to dig deep for this one because I'm trying to think about, like, say you're a new CISO, or you're just not, you don't have the acumen just yet to build that trust. What advice would you give to somebody who's trying to do exactly just that, what you just described?
Sure. I would, so you're talking about the relationship between the CISO and the CIO, or whoever they report to?
Whoever they're reporting to.
Yeah, I'm with you. So keep it simple. That sounds pretty straightforward, but I think you have to have expectations set between frankly, the whole board, the whole ELT, but certainly with the CIO, if that's who you report to. You've got to have clear expectations set about here's where we're going to make progress. The other things that I would tell someone is, in my view is, if you do not understand the language of business, which I think of as finance and economics, you should go and learn that. And I tell a lot of junior people, if you don't know anything about that, go and learn. You don't have to be an expert, but you ought to understand finance and return on investment and return on capital and profit and loss statements and balance sheets and economics and geopolitical pressure and all of those things, because that's largely the language of business. And top business leaders, whether you're running an ice cream stand or a $200 billion company, that is a language they understand. And your ability to take technical information and security risk information and weave or translate into business speak so that the business, both the senior leadership team, your boss, and the board can understand it, is really critical, I think, in building trust. And I constantly go back to that word trust, because that is the critical component. You're not going to be successful, in my view, you're not going to be successful in a CISO role if you can't build trust with the leadership team, your boss, and the board. You're going to have a hard time if you can't do that. Trust and integrity are absolutely critical. And of course, most people I know in the cybersecurity space, integrity is rarely an issue. Sometimes I guess it probably is, but most of the time it's not.
Fair point. The CIO, would you imagine that he or she would be even further along that path of understanding the business and industry context and the geo risks, et cetera? Or should the CISO try to aspire to that same level?
The CIO, I think, is a lot further along that path, right? They understand that. I mean, here's another way I'd frame it, right? Like most companies are somewhere on the journey of I use the buzzword digitization, right? Some are way further along the path, some are just starting, but almost every company on the planet is somewhere on that digitization journey. my view is that when the pandemic happened, that really accelerated the digital transformation for a lot of companies. It speeded up. Oh my gosh, we better start pedaling faster. Now we have to have everybody work remotely. Our customers all have to reach us remotely. So it sort of accelerated that capability. And I think the CIOs and the CISOs understand that's part of the program, right? An example I'll give you there is, so my view is there's sort of 4 big macro drivers that are driving most security programs, right? And none of them are rocket science. They're just it's a way to think about it at the macro level, right?
Yeah.
The first one is that the threat landscape's getting worse, right? So the bad guys are getting worse. There's tons of data to totally back that up. It's billions and billions of loss, right? State-sponsored attackers from the big 4: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, right? It's getting worse, right? And that's very clear. So that's the first big driver of the program.
Yeah.
The second one is that regulators and a lot of customers are getting a lot more prescriptive about what their expectation is of a company in terms of cybersecurity and protecting their information. And the SEC is coming in and saying, you're going to do these things and you're going to report an incident in this much time. Customers are coming in and saying, you're going to use this kind of encryption and you're going to encrypt all my data. So that creates a lot of variation in the environment, which drives part of the program. So that's kind of the second macro thing that's happening. The third is this, and that's what made me think of it, is this: all of us are on this digital transformation journey. While we're doing that, the technology ecosystem is becoming more and more complex and complicated. I used to refer to it all the time as the Frankenstein ecosystem.
Right.
We're connecting to more and more third parties and more partners and more customers. There are thousands of connections, and that's also very difficult to manage, especially from a risk, and it creates a lot of challenge or variation in the environment, which drives the program.
Right.
And then the final one is, because of all that, the other thing that's happening is businesses are becoming much more dependent on technology. Now, not to say that they weren't, but if you think pre-COVID, right? Yeah, the system, if it was down a couple hours here or there, you could sort of survive. If a farmer cuts a fiber and your systems go down for 4 hours, you just sort of recovered.
Yeah.
Today, that's not okay. I mean, literally, you're losing money. You could even be creating a life and death sort of situation with access to care, for example. So the other way I put it is, 2 nines, 99.99 used to be sort of okay. Now everybody wants 99.999999. You know what I mean? But you know what? Each one of those nines has an exponential additional cost to it. So there's a balance there, if that makes any sense. But to me, those are kind of the 4 macro factors that drive most security programs today, I would argue.
Yeah, and when you put them all together, I mean, now we see why there's a cybersecurity talent gap, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I literally just read a statistic last week. I think it was ISC squared, but don't hold me to that. That said there are 4 million open cybersecurity jobs today across the globe. And the last statistic I saw for the U.S. was at about 650,000 open jobs. So we definitely have an upside-down supply-demand problem there. And I think as a community, as a cybersecurity community, we have to work together to try to fix that. One, get more people at a younger age more interested in cyber as a career. Don't get me wrong, I think generative AI will help. It will probably help us automate some things that today we need people for.
Yeah.
But to me, even with that help, there's still a big challenge, and there isn't that many seasoned people. And the one other thing I'll touch on here is, the other thing, I was having this discussion with a colleague a few days ago. The other thing is, really when cyber began to pick up steam was sort of 2000, right? So the year but we got through Y2K, and then everybody started, the use of the internet started to explode, so cybersecurity became a big deal. It doesn't mean there wasn't security before, but when it really took off is about 2000, right? So we're almost 25 years in, And a lot of the leaders that were in security in the 2000 range, let's put them in their mid-30s or something like that because they're in the leadership role, they're now up here towards retirement age. Never mind the stress on the job and the burnout that you see in it. But the point is, I think we're seeing a cycle, right, of people that are retiring or going to a different kind of a job out, and that's going to create another bump, and oh my gosh, we don't have enough people in the cyberspace.
Yeah, and that makes the challenge even greater.
Yes.
And if cybersecurity increasingly moves into automation and machines, maybe that's the way you're going to meet that scale and meet that challenge.
Yeah,
right?
you know,
it just disappears.
It's funny you say that too, because I was sitting in a meeting, and I won't say who said this because I'm not allowed to, I don't think. But I thought this was brilliantly said. I was in a meeting Tuesday with many other security leaders, and what they said is the cybersecurity team of the future will be code. I mean, like, period, right? It's not going to be human-driven, and it's not going to be able to be human-driven, and then we had some discussion around that because of things like generative AI, which are moving at a speed where there is no way, today, 0-day vulnerability comes out, and the bad guys have gotten, it used to take, weeks before they'd exploit. Now it's like days or hours. It's going to be seconds, right, pretty soon. And when it is, there's no human that's going to be able to react to that, right? Yeah. So we are moving towards software to have to defend that, which is a really interesting way to think about it.
A great example of an industry that took care of this challenge earlier is like online advertising, right? Auctions for keyword search, display, all that. Seems like it left the human world and into the domain of the machine world a long time ago.
Yes. Because
all the parameters and the split-second decisions that needed to be made for behavioral targeting, that was the place.
Yes.
And we're never going back. Right?
Absolutely. And at least in that world, it's much more, probably somebody's going to beat me up for saying this, but it's much more straightforward and black and white and machine learning capable, right? Yeah. But boy, when you begin to get into the cyber risk world, there's a lot more context. And again, I think generative AI is going to be able to help us with that. But there's a lot more context that you have to have in order to make a decision, right? If the you're gonna block the virus or block some life-saving something that has to happen. You know what I'm saying? The context becomes much more important, right?
It's an exponential problem.
Yes. Well,
this is a podcast for CIOs. It doesn't mean that we never had a CISO on the podcast. In fact, I think it's great that we have this crossover across the 3 different shows we have on revolutionaries. But diving into the role of the CISO and looking at some of these security threats, and now we have deep fakes, synthetic content, AI-driven phishing. I mean, it's just getting into social engineering. Just getting really, really complex, and it seems like it's a challenge that's so formidable. Like, how are we actually going to get there? So, going back to the board and how you communicate these things and communicate the effectiveness of controls, your policies, your procedures. I'm sure there's certifications that your team has to sign off on. Like, how does a CISO, and maybe partner with your CIO, overcome all this complexity?
Not easily, that's for sure. But again, what I tend to do is I tend to try to simplify. I mean, I'm a big, and maybe it's just my simple brain and the way it works, but I tend to simplify things. And for whatever reason, I like the whole 5. People can remember 5 things generally pretty well. So I try to, it doesn't always work out, but most of the time it does. And so when I talk about threats, for example, which is what you're touching on here, right? I also put the threats, we already talked about the risk, I put the threats in kind of 5 key categories, and I think they pretty much cover, I'm sure there's stuff that don't cover, but 99% covered by the way I talk to the threat landscape, again, when I'm talking to executive leaders or boards of directors. And not anything surprising, but I'll walk through them real quick, right? Yeah. The first one, which is the one that I don't think gets enough credit, is mistakes and accidents, right? And if you look at the data clearly shows, the last time I saw the data, about 85% of all big breaches start with somebody doing something stupid. Now, it could be because a malicious person tried to get you to click on a phishing link. So there's a little bit of a differentiation there. But the fact is, right, though, that's what the data shows. So the first one is mistakes and accidents, and anything you can do from a control perspective to help keep people from the mistake or the accident. If you filter out all the bad phishing emails, as a super simple example, then great. Then I can't click on it if I don't get the email, right? So that's the first one. The second one I kind of categorize as organized crime. That's not really broad enough, but it is everything from state-sponsored actors who may be just trying to disrupt your democracy, or financially motivated actors that are, at this point, very organized, right? You can go online. There's about 25 different ransomware as a service opportunities. You can just go out and buy it. You don't have to know the first thing, technically, to go run a ransomware, right? So the second category is the organized crime, and pretty much everybody understands what that means. And then you can talk about who the big threat actors are and what have you, right?
Yes.
The third one is vulnerabilities, right? And this one, okay, now you're a little bit more geeky and technical, right? It's vulnerabilities in software code. They're not going away, right? You're always going to have vulnerabilities. The numbers of vulnerabilities are going up, and I don't have those stats in the back of my head here, but you can go out and pull it up, and they are exponentially increasing. And the reason is pretty simple. If you step back and think about it, the reason is pretty simple. We build bigger, faster computers, right? And what happens when you build a faster computer? The software guys write bigger, fancier code that can execute more operations. And the example I use here is, if I remember correctly, Windows 3, right? Which, I know that makes me old. Windows 3 was around 5 million lines of code. Windows 10 is around 55 million lines of code. So with generative AI, we're going to be writing billion lines of code. You're going to have vulnerabilities always. There's no way you can write perfect code. That's just not possible. So anyway, I kind of went on a tangent there, but vulnerabilities is a third one, and it is one everybody has to pay attention to. You want to try to keep your environment as vulnerability free as you can, which is not an easy task. That's a huge problem. The next one is, I term it unauthorized software, right? So in any given technology environment, you always are going to have a bunch of software in there that nobody has vetted and truly ensured that it's safe and it won't create holes or gaps in the technology, right? Think about just little API, little downloads of little pieces of software that may help you print or help you do something, and almost no one can prevent that without harming the productivity of the employee base. So you're always going to have this layer of unauthorized software. You can also put shadow IT in that bucket, which is a common.
Now shadow AI, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then the final one is lack of education, if you will. So it's just pure up the good old-fashioned social engineering. It's lack of education, right? I love the phrase I use all the time is, there's no patch for stupidity, right? And so it's incumbent upon us as a security program and as a company to make sure that we're training people and making them aware of what to look out for. I mean, we are all trying to build cyber-savvy workforces, and that's actually number one defense against crime is against the bad guys is to get everybody well educated, and that's an ongoing and continuous threat. The lack of education is a threat vector that gets used commonly, and like I said, the data clearly shows somewhere 80 to 85% are a mistake or an accident. It's not super senior complicated mathematician hackers in a dark room. I mean, there is 15% that are exploiting vulnerabilities or whatever, but why bother all that when I can just send you a phishing email and get you to click on the link and give me your credentials?
So to boost that education level, putting aside things like annual security awareness training and maybe like internal phishing experiments to see which employees know what they're doing, those that don't. But have you, in your career, seen anything else in this realm that can help?
Yes. I'll tell you what I think works the best, right? And we use this at both GE as well as at Cigna. You got to make it personal, right? That's what really helps, right? And so what I mean by that is, if I hold a seminar or put a podcast or a video cast out, and I title it, please come learn how to protect the company's data. Like everybody, they go, oh God, I've got to go to, oh my gosh, do I have to do this? Or half paying attention, checking their iPhone. If I say, come learn how to protect the information of your 12-year-old daughter or your 85-year-old grandmother, all of a sudden they're standing room only. If we're doing something live in an auditorium, right? So I think you can, and I sort of say that to just make the point, but you can make the training personal to the individual. How do I protect my equipment at home and my family's information? What are things I can do? And you can easily weave in, by the way, you should also take the same due care with Cigna's data or GE's data or whoever's data. So that has been a pretty effective way to get people more interested in it. The other trick I think is small batches, right? That's the other, because you're right, everybody has their annual hour and a half, oh my God, I got to go an hour and a half training, I got to take a test, I got to make an 80, and they go click, 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 and they get through it and they pay no attention. I think if you do small bits and pieces, it's easier for people to conceptualize, and you can make it funny, right? Like you can do a little 2-minute like a YouTube video on how to create a strong passphrase, for example, and you can make it funny. So those are things that I've seen that have been more effective at getting people engaged in learning more about the cyberspace.
I can totally see it.
You can gamify it too. That's a third one.
Edutainment, gamification, right?
Exactly.
All kinds of ways.
Yes.
And it could be like just put out in increments and not necessarily like a grand event every year.
Exactly, yeah. You can just put it, because most people, I think I read somewhere a statistic, although I can't tell you now who it was from, but some sociologist or somebody that said, man, you got about 7 or 8 minutes for most people, and even that's probably a stretch now. Because everybody's so used to social media, you're constantly looking at your phone. You've got about 2 minutes of people's attention, and then they're off to the next thing.
Right. They call that continuous partial attention, where you're never really doing one thing. At least now we're looking at each other and having this conversation.
That's true.
Kind of weird if I was on Twitter at the same time, although I could be tweeting some of this out. So James, listening to you for the last half hour, it's evident that you have a lot of seasoned expertise, a lot of experiences from the front lines, and it's a gift to the industry to be able to share and pass along this wisdom, right? What I was thinking, for the next just 5 or so minutes, we'll talk about leadership and some things that anybody listening could take away, even if they're not in a security leadership position or IT position. So what's the one trait you wish you could instill in every employee, and why do you think it's important?
Well, the one trait. Well, you're going to make me boil it down to one trait, right? If I had to absolutely pick one, honestly, I don't know if I can get to just one, Chris. But the one I would start with is integrity, right? You must have integrity. And the reason I say that is it's the most critical component for trust, right? And to me, one of the keys to be an effective leader, and I don't care what you're leading, it doesn't have to be cybersecurity, is trust. And to get trust with people, you need to have integrity, because if you don't do, if you lie to people or you don't do what you said you were going to, you're not going to maintain a trust relationship very long, right? Yeah. So I kind of feel like that's the biggest one. The other one I use, and it's a GE-ism a little bit, is called the say-do ratio. You want to have a high say-do ratio, right? So do what you said you were going to do. Now stuff happens and you can't always do things perfectly. I get that, but if you've got a low say-do ratio, you're going to have a hard time maintaining that trust relationship, and that's going to be difficult for you as a leader, right?
It's a good take on the walk the talk.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I used to say to my kids all the time, there's only 168 hours in a week, right? And that's the one thing that you have absolutely no control over whatsoever. There's always going to be 168. Yeah. You can't add to it. You can't take it away. What you can do is you can think through, how am I going to divide that 168 hours a week? How many hours am I going to give to my job? 40, 60, 70, sometimes more, whatever. The point is you can control what you're doing with that time. And I think that's another critical thing I would say. The other thing I would say is diversity. Absolutely, always makes the best solutions. Like period, right? 35 years I've been in the technology space. The more diverse the team, the better the solution. Now, it might take a little bit longer sometimes, but you are always going to get a better solution with a diverse team. Diversity of all kinds, by the way. Skills, backgrounds, ethnicities, all education, the whole 9 yards. The more diverse a team is, the better solution you're going to get every single time. That's
Is that
held
because
true.
it just translates directly into collaboration and best ideas surface?
I think so. Yeah, exactly. I think you get the more perspectives you get, which again can sometimes also create some challenge. But if you get to a common spot and are able to come out with a solution, it is always a stronger solution than it would be by coming out of a non-diverse or oversimplified space. I say, know your strengths, right? Strengths and weaknesses. I'm a big strengths finder kind of person. I'm sure the strengths finder people probably love that. But don't kill yourself worrying about. You can wear yourself out and expend too much of those 168 hours trying to shore up a weakness versus go work your strengths. And if you don't have strengths, go collaborate with people that have those strengths that you don't have to collaborate better. So I always tell people to focus on that. Courage is another one, another word I use pretty frequently. You got to have courage, particularly now. That's particularly true in a cybersecurity job. You got to have courage. And the other thing that I tend to tell people that are looking at a leadership role is always try to work yourself out of a job. Most people look at me and go, why would I want to work myself out of a job? But what I have found over the years is, if you're trying to work yourself out of a job, you are always going to find yourself in a really good spot. I tell junior folks a lot of times, sign up for the most horrible project. You'd be the first one to raise your hand to take on that horrible project, because you know what? You will get a lot of kudos for having raised your hand to take on the horrible job. Everybody understands it's a horrible job, and you will learn absolutely from that horrible job in general. And you will learn a lot. And even if it fails, it won't matter because you've learned a lot from it. Everybody understood it was a horrible job to start with. Most people shy away from that. I'd say be the first one to raise your hand.
Somebody gave me that exact same advice about 10, 15 years ago. So I think you'll be remembered as somebody who has the courage.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you're right. I never thought about the fact that it ties directly to it shows that you've got courage, right? And I tell you, I've learned several things, key lessons from my teams, right? One, and our CEO is actually fond of saying this all the time, and I love the saying, right? And that is, seek first to understand before seeking to be understood. I love that quote because, and people who know me know I'm a Judge Judy fan, which everybody goes, oh my gosh, don't tell me that. But I am. I got to admit, I watch it when I'm working out. But and she says all the time, there's a reason God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, is you should listen more and talk less. Right. So that's also been kind of a valuable.
Active listening, right? I think
active
underrated
active
for sure.
listening, yeah. The team's also taught me the value and importance of humility and empathy. Those are 2 really important leadership traits from my point of view. It helps personalize what you've got to get to know your team and get to know your people. Failure makes the world go round. You're not as smart as you think you are. I mean, I feel like I get dumber every day because I find out something else I don't know anything about.
I got one more for you. Add to the list, because I've been listening how you structure your responses for simplicity, right?
Yeah.
The rule of 5s. Now, I don't know if it was Leonardo da Vinci. It was one of those guys who said, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And I think you're seeing that on display here, and with all levels of leadership, you could boil it down to something that's tangible and understandable.
That's exactly right.
You've connected.
Yeah. And the quote I love there, which I like that one too. The quote I love there, and it depends on where you look. They supposedly attributed this to Mark Twain, and what he says is, if I'd had more time, I'd have written a shorter novel.
Right.
And I love that, right? Because you're right. Simplicity is also very much a key. And the other thing I say all the time is communications are critical. Transparency and communications. But the more complex the communication, the harder it is, to have everybody be in sync. And in my experience, most of the time when something fails, a project or whatever it is, it's because something got lost in translation. And so there wasn't any malicious intent. You know what I mean? It was just something got lost in translation. You said you wanted 4 fields, and you know what I mean? It's the old requirements thing, and then inevitably you produce this this thing that wasn't what the expectation was.
And it could have been just a moment lapse of understanding, right?
Yeah.
We've been listening to James Beeson, advisor, board member, and investor, former Global CISO for the Cigna Group and GE Capital Companies. James, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for the time, Chris. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to the CIO Evolution. Check back with your podcast provider regularly for more episodes. You can find more episodes along with other podcasts on the CXO Revolutionaries website at revolutionaries.zscaler.com. Statements by Zscaler podcasters and guests are informational only and should never be construed as legal advice. You should consult your legal advisor on matters related to you or your business. Zscaler makes no warranties, express, implied, or statutory as to the content of this podcast, and it is provided as is. Content on this podcast may contain forward-looking statements that are current as of the date of the recording and subject to change. These statements are subject to the safe harbor provisions created by the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995. Full legal disclaimers are available at revolutionaries.zscaler.com. Copyright 2021.